The alarm tore through the corridor before I had even finished my morning ration. Red light washed over the walls of Kestrel Outpost, and every officer within reach of a terminal was already moving. I dropped my cup, grabbed my sidearm from the wall rack, and ran toward the command deck with my heart slamming against my ribs. 3 years on this border station, and I had never heard that particular tone before. It meant something was closing in on us fast, and nobody yet knew what. My name is Yura Sen. I am a defense officer of the Valari people, assigned to watch the edge of coalition space, where the stars grow thin and the old trade routes turn dangerous. My skin carries faint streaks of blue that shift when I feel strong emotion, a trait my own people can read easily, but that outsiders often miss entirely. That morning, if anyone skilled in reading Valari coloring had looked at me, they would have seen a storm. On the command deck, Commander Doran Vex stood over the main display, his eyes narrow, his 4 fingers tapping against the console in a rapid, uneven rhythm. Sensors had picked up 3 unregistered vessels approaching from the outer belt, moving in a pattern that matched known raider formations. My chest tightened. Raiders meant the Skarn, and the Skarn meant trouble that our small outpost was not built to handle alone. For one long minute, we all held our breath and watched the blinking dots crawl closer on the screen. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the vessels altered course and slipped away into the dark, vanishing beyond our sensor range. A scouting run. Nothing more this time. The tension in the room broke like a held breath finally released, and I let my shoulders drop for the first time since the alarm had sounded. Commander Vex straightened and addressed the room, his voice steady again. "That was too close," he said. "If they come back in greater numbers, we will need more than our own defenses to hold this line. I already sent the request. Reinforcement should be arriving within the hour." I did not think much of it at the time. Reinforcement usually meant another squad of Valari soldiers, or perhaps a support vessel from a neighboring outpost. I returned to my post, filed my report, and tried to steady my racing thoughts. It was only later, when the docking bay doors opened and a single figure stepped out, that I understood the reinforcement Commander Vex had called for was not what any of us expected. He was human. I had heard about humans before, of course. Every officer in the coalition had heard the stories, whispered in mess halls and repeated in official briefings with a strange mixture of doubt and unease. Humans, they said, could survive injuries that would kill any of us twice over. Humans laughed in the middle of danger, as though fear worked differently in their minds. Humans had joined the coalition only a handful of years earlier, yet already their name carried a weight that made even seasoned commanders lower their voices. I had dismissed most of it as exaggeration, the kind of tale that grows larger every time it is told. Standing in the docking bay that day, watching this one human walk down the ramp with an easy, unhurried stride, I still believed that. He did not look like a legend. He looked like a tired soldier carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder, scanning the room with calm, sharp eyes. Commander Vex greeted him with a formal nod. "This is Ethan Cole," he announced to the gathered officers. "He has been assigned to Kestrel Outpost as our human liaison and combat advisor, following the new coalition agreement. Treat him as you would any officer of equal rank." Ethan Cole raised a hand in a simple, casual greeting that felt strangely out of place amid our formal ranks. "Good to meet you all," he said. His voice was calm, almost relaxed, as though he had not just arrived at a border post that had nearly faced a raider incursion an hour earlier. I noticed the way he studied the room, without seeming to study it at all, his gaze moving briefly over each exit, each console, each of us, before settling into an easy stance. I remember thinking, in that first moment, that he seemed unremarkable, not unfriendly, not unimpressive, simply ordinary in a way that did not match the stories. I told myself the tales must have grown taller with each retelling, the way stories often do among frightened crews stationed too far from home. Commander Vex assigned him to my division without much explanation, stating only that our unit handled perimeter defense and needed someone with combat experience to help refine our protocols. I was given the task of showing him around the outpost, introducing him to our systems and making sure he settled into our routines without friction. I accepted the assignment the way I accepted any order, professionally and without complaint, though privately I wondered what use a single human soldier could truly be against raider ships and coordinated assaults. As I led him through the narrow corridors of Kestrel Outpost, I found myself watching him more closely than I intended. He asked good questions about our sensor range, our shield rotations, our evacuation routes. He listened carefully to my answers, nodding at the right moments, occasionally asking a follow-up question that showed he had actually understood what I said rather than simply pretending to. We reached the sparring room near the end of the tour, a modest space with padded walls where soldiers trained during quiet hours. Ethan paused at the doorway and glanced inside. "Mind if I get a feel for how your people train?" he asked. "I do better learning a place once I have moved through it a little." I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Training alongside a new officer was common practice, meant to build trust and familiarity before real danger arrived. I did not expect much from the exercise. My people are quick and precise fighters, trained since childhood in close combat forms, suited to our lighter frames and faster reflexes. I assumed a human, larger and slower by design, would struggle to keep pace with our style. I was wrong, though not in the way the old rumors suggested. Ethan did not overpower me with strength or speed. Instead, he moved with a kind of patient awareness, reading my attacks before I fully committed to them, adjusting his stance calmly instead of reacting with panic or aggression. When we finished our brief exchange, both of us breathing harder than before, he offered a small, genuine smile. "You are fast," he said, "faster than most people I have trained with. I will need to adjust." There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to prove himself greater than he was. Just an honest observation, delivered plainly. I found myself oddly pleased by the comment, though I could not explain why at the time. I told myself it was simple professional satisfaction, the kind any officer might feel after a fair assessment from a new colleague. Over the following days, Ethan settled into the rhythm of Kestrel Outpost more smoothly than I expected. He worked well with the other officers, human and Valari alike, showing neither the arrogance nor the recklessness the rumors had promised. He asked thoughtful questions during briefings, offered suggestions that improved our defense rotations without dismissing the systems we had already built, and generally proved himself a capable, level-headed addition to our small station. I continued working alongside him as part of my duties, coordinating patrol schedules and reviewing sensor logs together during quiet shifts. It was simple, professional collaboration, nothing more than what any two officers assigned to the same division might share. At least, that is what I told myself each time I found myself glancing toward him a moment longer than necessary, or noticing small details about him that had no bearing on our work at all. The way he hummed quietly under his breath while repairing damaged equipment, the way he always made sure everyone else in the room had eaten before he touched his own meal, the way his calm demeanor never cracked, even during the tense hours when our sensors picked up distant, unidentified signals near the border. I noticed these things the way one might notice interesting details about any new colleague, filing them away without much thought, never once considering that they meant anything beyond simple observation. Commander Vex called a brief meeting near the end of that first week, gathering the senior officers to discuss the growing pattern of raider activity along our sector. The scouting run we had seen earlier was not an isolated event. Reports from neighboring outposts described similar sightings, unregistered vessels probing coalition defenses, testing response times, searching for weaknesses. "They are preparing for something larger," Commander Vex said, his voice grave as he studied the display. "I want every division running at full readiness. If the Skarn decide to move against Kestrel directly, we cannot afford to be caught unprepared again." Ethan spoke up from his seat near the back of the room, his tone calm but firm. "If they come, they will come fast and from more than one direction. Raiders like the Skarn tend to favor overwhelming numbers over precision. We should assume they will try to hit multiple points at once and split our attention." Commander Vex studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Noted," he said. "Sen, Work with Cole to update our perimeter response plan based on that assumption. I want revised protocols by the end of the week. I accepted the assignment with a simple nod, though something in me stirred at the idea of spending more focused time working alongside Ethan. I told myself it was simply professional interest, the natural curiosity of an officer eager to improve her outpost defenses. It would take much longer and much more danger before I finally understood that what stirred inside me that day had very little to do with defense protocols at all. As the meeting ended and officers filed out to return to their posts, I lingered near the doorway, watching Ethan gather his notes with the same calm, unhurried patience he brought to everything else. He caught my eye and offered a small nod, a simple acknowledgement between colleagues, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. I returned the gesture and turned to leave, unaware that the quiet, ordinary days of our partnership were numbered, and that the true test of everything I thought I understood about strength and about myself was already gathering somewhere out beyond the dark edge of our sensors. The days that followed the meeting settled into a new kind of rhythm, one built around the revised perimeter plan Commander Vex had asked us to prepare. Ethan and I spent long hours together in the small planning room near the command deck, poring over sensor maps, adjusting patrol routes, and running simulations of possible raider approaches. It should have felt like ordinary work, the kind of task any two officers might share without a second thought. Somehow, it never quite felt ordinary to me, though I could not yet name the reason why. Ethan had a habit of thinking out loud while he worked, muttering half-formed ideas under his breath before shaping them into full suggestions. At first I found it distracting, the low murmur of his voice threading through my concentration. Before long, I found myself listening for it instead, waiting for the moment his thoughts would spill into words I could respond to. We built a rhythm together, trading ideas back and forth, correcting each other's assumptions, filling gaps in each other's knowledge. He understood raider tactics from years of frontier service. I understood our outpost systems better than anyone else on the station. Between the two of us, the new protocols began to take real shape. One evening, after a particularly long stretch of work, Ethan set down his tablet and rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. "You have not eaten today, have you?" he said. It was not really a question. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing he was right. The hours had slipped past me entirely, swallowed by maps and simulations. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small ration pack, offering it across the table without ceremony. "Eat," he said. "You are no good to this outpost if you fall over from hunger during a briefing." I took the ration with a quiet word of thanks, surprised by the simple kindness of the gesture. It was such a small thing, and yet it settled somewhere warm in my chest, a feeling I did not examine too closely at the time. Small moments like that became more common as the days passed. He always seemed to notice when others around him needed something before they noticed it themselves, whether it was food, rest, or simply a quiet word of encouragement during a difficult shift. I told myself this was simply his nature, the mark of a good soldier who cared for the well-being of his unit. I did not yet understand that the warmth spreading through me whenever he turned that same care toward me specifically was something different from the care he offered everyone else. Our sparring sessions continued as well, though they grew less like formal training exercises and more like something else entirely, something neither of us named aloud. We would meet in the padded room during quiet hours, testing new techniques against each other, laughing when a move failed, offering quiet praise when one of us managed something clever. I found myself looking forward to those sessions more than I looked forward to almost anything else in my daily routine, though I told myself it was simply the satisfaction of good training, nothing more. One evening, as we finished a session and sat catching our breath along the padded wall, Ethan asked me about my home. Not the outpost, but the world where I had grown up, the family I had left behind to serve on the frontier. I found myself telling him more than I intended, describing the wide silver skies of my homeworld, the way my people communicated through subtle shifts in skin color long before we learned to speak with words, the quiet ceremonies my family held each season to mark the turning of the year. He listened with genuine attention, asking questions at the right moments, never once making me feel as though I was simply filling silence with unimportant details. In return, he told me about his own home, a place called Earth that I had heard mentioned in briefings but never understood in any personal way. He spoke of green hills and open oceans, of a childhood spent training in combat sports, long before humanity had ever encountered the wider coalition of stars. There was a softness in his voice when he spoke of home, a softness that felt strangely intimate, as though he was offering me something private and unguarded. I did not fully understand, in that moment, why his trust meant so much to me. I only knew that I wanted to hear more, that I found myself hoping he would keep talking long after the conversation naturally should have ended. Word of the raider activity continued to filter in from neighboring outposts as the days passed, each report a little more concerning than the last. Ships spotted testing defenses along the border, supply convoys stripped of their cargo, a distant listening post that had gone silent for nearly 2 full days before finally re-establishing contact, its crew shaken but alive. Commander Vex grew more tense with each new report, tightening our readiness protocols further, insisting on additional drills and inspections. Through it all, Ethan remained a steady presence, calm in a way that helped settle the growing unease among the rest of us. He never dismissed the danger, never pretended the situation was less serious than it truly was, but he also never let fear control his actions. I found myself drawing strength from that steadiness, leaning on it more than I probably should have, as an officer meant to project calm confidence of my own. One quiet afternoon, while reviewing sensor logs together in the planning room, Ethan noticed the faint blue streaks along my arms had shifted to a deeper shade than usual. "What does that mean?" he asked, nodding toward the color. I hesitated, unsure how to explain something so personal to someone outside my own people. "It shows emotion," I finally said. "Stronger feelings show as deeper color. It is how my people read each other, sometimes more honestly than words allow." He studied the color for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "What are you feeling right now?" he asked, his tone gentle rather than intrusive. I found myself unable to answer honestly, not because I did not know, but because I was not yet ready to admit it, even to myself. I told him it was simply concern over the raider reports, which was true, though it was far from the whole truth. He accepted the answer without pressing further, though I caught him glancing toward my arms once or twice more before returning to his work. As the days stretched into weeks, our partnership deepened in ways I struggled to fully name. We covered each other's shifts without being asked. We shared meals more often than duty strictly required. We developed small, unspoken routines, checking in with each other at the start and end of every day, trading brief updates that had little to do with official reports and everything to do with simply wanting to know the other was well. I began to notice things about myself that troubled me in a quiet, persistent way, the way my thoughts drifted toward him during idle moments, the way a simple greeting from him in the corridor could brighten an otherwise difficult day, the way I found myself preparing a little more carefully before our shared shifts. Though I told myself it was simply professional pride, I dismissed each of these observations as they arose, filing them away under simpler explanations, unwilling or perhaps unready to confront what they truly meant. Commander Vex called another briefing near the end of the 3rd week, this time with a heavier tone than before. "Intelligence suggests the Skarn are consolidating their scattered raiding parties into a single larger force," he announced, his eyes moving across the gathered officers. "Their pattern of movement suggests they are preparing for a direct assault on one of our border outposts. Given our position and resources, Kestrel is a likely target." The room fell silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over all of us. I glanced toward Ethan without meaning to, searching his expression for some sign of the fear I felt tightening in my own chest. Instead, I found only calm determination, the same steady resolve he carried into every challenge since his arrival. "We prepare," he said simply, breaking the silence. "We know they are coming. That gives us an advantage most outposts under attack do not have. Let us use it." Commander Vex nodded, visibly steadied by the simple confidence in Ethan's voice. "Agreed," he said. "Sen, Cole, I want your revised protocols finalized and distributed to every division by tomorrow morning. If the Skarn are truly coming, I want this outpost ready to meet them. We worked through the night that followed, refining the last details of our defense plan, testing simulations until every officer on the station understood their role in the coming days. Somewhere in the exhaustion of those long hours, Ethan reached over and gently touched my shoulder, a small gesture of reassurance that lingered far longer in my thoughts than the moment itself should have allowed. "We will get through this," he said quietly. "I have seen worse odds turn out fine before." I wanted to believe him completely, and in that moment, watching the steady certainty in his eyes, I very nearly did. What I did not yet realize, as the night wore on and the danger drew closer with each passing hour, was how much of my growing hope rested not simply in our defense plan, but in him specifically. That realization was still waiting for me, hidden somewhere just beyond the horizon of the coming battle, ready to reveal itself only when everything else around me had already begun to fall apart. The alarm came at the darkest hour of the night cycle, tearing me from a shallow, restless sleep. I was on my feet before I had even fully registered the sound, pulling on my armor with hands that shook only slightly. Every instinct told me this was not another false approach, not another scouting run that would vanish before it reached us. This time, the ships were not turning away. I reached the command deck to find it already in controlled chaos, officers shouting coordinates, engineers routing emergency power to the shield generators, Commander Vex standing at the center of it all with his jaw set tight. "3 large vessels on approach," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "Multiple smaller craft breaking off to flank our secondary defenses. This is the assault we feared." I found my post at the eastern perimeter station, my hands moving over the controls with practiced speed even as my mind raced ahead of my training. Through the reinforced viewport, I could see the first flashes of light in the distance, weapons fire streaking between our outer defense platforms and the approaching raider ships. The battle had begun, and there was no more time for fear, only for action. Ethan appeared beside me moments later, already dressed for combat, his expression calm in a way that steadied my racing pulse despite everything happening around us. "Eastern approach is exposed," he said, studying the tactical display over my shoulder. "If they break through here, they reach the fuel depot within minutes. We cannot let that happen." Commander Vex agreed instantly, ordering additional units to reinforce our position. The next several minutes blurred together in a rush of orders and adjustments, shield rotations timed against incoming fire, defense turrets redirected to cover gaps in our coverage, communication channels crowded with urgent updates from every corner of the outpost. I stayed focused on my station, running the protocols Ethan and I had built together over the past weeks, watching them hold against the first waves of the assault exactly as we had planned. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as though our preparation might be enough. The outer defense platforms held their ground, our shields absorbed the worst of the incoming fire, and the smaller raider craft attempting to flank our position found themselves caught in overlapping fields of defense turret fire, forced back toward the larger vessels they had launched from. Then the eastern shield generator failed. The alert flashed across every console at once, a piercing tone that cut through the noise of the command deck like a blade. Commander Vex's voice rose above the chaos, ordering immediate repair teams to the generator room, but I already knew from the diagnostic readout that repairs would take time we did not have. Without that shield section, the eastern perimeter lay exposed, and the fuel depot beyond it sat undefended against anything that managed to break through. Ethan was already moving before Commander Vex finished speaking, grabbing his weapon and heading for the corridor that led toward the exposed section. "I am going to help hold the breach," he called back over his shoulder. "Keep the sensors on me, Sen. I will need eyes on anything approaching from outside my line of sight." I wanted to argue, to tell him the danger was too great for a single soldier to face alone, but there was no time, and something in his expression told me he had already made his decision. I turned back to my console instead, forcing my hands steady as I opened a direct channel to guide him through the darkened corridors toward the breach. The following minutes stretched into something that felt both impossibly long and impossibly fast. I watched through scattered sensor feeds as Ethan reached the exposed section just as the first raider craft broke through the gap in our shields, landing hard against the outer hull with a force that shook the entire structure of the outpost. Through the crackling comm channel, I heard the sounds of combat begin, sharp and controlled, nothing like the panicked chaos I might have expected from a single soldier facing an unknown number of enemies alone. "Movement to your left," I called through the channel, watching a second group of raiders circle toward his position from a maintenance corridor our sensors had only just picked up. "3 targets, closing fast." "Copy that," he replied, his voice remarkably steady given the situation. I heard the sounds shift through the comm, quick and decisive, and moments later the sensor readout showed the threat neutralized, the raiders no longer registering as active. I allowed myself a single breath of relief before the readings shifted again, showing a much larger group approaching from the primary breach point, far more than Ethan could reasonably face alone. "Commander Vex," I said urgently, turning toward the center of the command deck. "Cole needs support at the eastern breach. The numbers are increasing faster than one soldier can hold." Commander Vex's expression tightened with the weight of an impossible decision. Every available unit was already engaged elsewhere, holding other breaches, defending other vulnerable points across the outpost. "We cannot pull anyone from their current positions without opening a new gap somewhere else," he said, his voice heavy with the truth of it. "Cole knew the risk when he went. We have to trust him to hold until repairs are finished." I understood the logic, even as every instinct in me rebelled against it. I turned back to my console, watching the sensor feed with a growing knot of fear tightening in my chest, feeding Ethan every scrap of information I could gather, every warning of movement, every shift in the numbers pressing against his position. It was all I could do from where I sat, and in that moment, it felt like nowhere near enough. The fighting continued, relentless and unyielding, the sensor readouts painting a picture I could barely stand to watch. Ethan held the breach far longer than seemed possible, his movements guided by skill and discipline that no rumor I had ever heard could have properly captured. Still, the numbers against him continued to grow, raider after raider pressing toward the gap, drawn by the promise of the fuel depot waiting just beyond his position. Through the comm channel, his breathing grew heavier, his responses shorter, though his voice never lost its steady calm. "I am managing," he said at one point, though the strain beneath the words was impossible to miss. "Just tell me the moment that shield comes back online." I relayed the message to the repair team, urging them to move faster, though I knew they were already working as quickly as humanly possible under the pressure of the moment. The minutes continued to stretch, each one feeling longer than the last, my eyes fixed on the sensor readout showing Ethan's position holding, barely, against odds that grew heavier with every passing second. Then the sensor feed flickered, static crackling across the display for one terrible, silent moment, before clearing again. Ethan's position had shifted, no longer holding steady at the breach but pushed back toward a narrower section of corridor, the numbers around him closing in from multiple directions at once. My chest tightened with a fear unlike anything I had felt before, sharper and more personal than simple concern for a fellow officer. "Cole, report," I said into the comm, my voice tighter than I intended. Silence answered me, broken only by the faint crackle of distant fighting still audible through the open channel. I called again, louder this time, my hands gripping the edge of my console hard enough to ache. A long, agonizing moment passed before his voice finally returned, breathless but alive. "Pushed back," he said. "Numbers are heavier than expected. I can hold a little longer, but I will need that shield soon." Relief and fear tangled together inside me in a way I did not have time to fully process. I relayed his status to Commander Vex, who ordered the repair team to redirect all available power toward finishing the shield restoration, sacrificing efficiency elsewhere across the outpost in exchange for speed. It was a gamble, one that left other sections more vulnerable in the short term, but with the eastern breach threatening to fall entirely, there seemed no other choice left to make. I kept my focus locked on the sensor feed, watching Ethan's position hold in that narrow corridor, watching the numbers around him shift and press without ever quite overwhelming him completely. Every instinct in me wanted to leave my post, to run toward the breach myself, despite knowing full well that my presence would do little against the numbers he faced. I forced myself to stay, to keep feeding him the information he needed, to trust that the steady calm in his voice meant he truly believed he could hold on. The shield generator alert flashed across my console at last, the repair team's voice crackling through with the news that restoration was nearly complete. I relayed the update to Ethan immediately, watching the sensor feed for any sign that the pressure against his position might finally begin to ease. Instead, the feed flickered again, longer this time, static swallowing the display entirely before it cut out completely, leaving only silence where his signal had been. My blood ran cold. I called his name into the comm channel again and again, my voice rising with a fear I could no longer contain, but no answer came, only the empty hiss of a connection that had gone terribly quiet at the worst possible moment. I do not remember standing up. One moment I was seated at my console, calling his name into a dead channel, and the next I was on my feet, my hands trembling against the edge of the desk, my mind refusing to accept the silence that had swallowed his signal. Commander Vex called my name from across the command deck, his voice sharp with concern, but I barely registered the sound. All I could think of was the empty static where his voice should have been. "Sen," Commander Vex said again, closer this time, his hand landing firmly on my shoulder. "The shield is back online. Full power is restored to the eastern section. Whatever happened, we have a chance to reinforce now." The words cut through the fog of panic just enough for me to nod, forcing my training to reassert itself over the fear threatening to consume me entirely. I gathered my weapon without waiting for formal orders, my legs already carrying me toward the corridor that led to the eastern breach before Commander Vex had finished speaking. He did not stop me. Perhaps he understood, in that moment, that nothing short of physical restraint would have kept me at my post. The corridors leading toward the breach were darker than usual, emergency lighting casting long red shadows across walls scorched by earlier fighting. I moved as quickly as my training allowed, my weapon raised, my senses straining for any sign of what lay ahead. The silence pressing in around me felt heavier with every step, broken only by the distant echo of fighting still continuing somewhere deeper in the station. I rounded the final corner leading toward the breach and found the corridor littered with the marks of a battle that had clearly been fierce and desperate. Scorch marks lined the walls, broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, and there, near the center of the wreckage, a group of raiders stood clustered together, weapons raised, their attention focused on something I could not yet see from my position. My chest tightened with dread as I raised my own weapon, preparing to do whatever I could to even the odds, though I already understood how impossibly outmatched I was against so many alone. Before I could act, movement stirred among the wreckage ahead, and a figure rose from behind a fallen support beam, weapon already moving with practiced, deadly precision. It was Ethan. He was breathing hard, a shallow cut along one side of his forehead, his armor scorched and dented in several places, but he was standing, and he was very much alive. Relief crashed through me with such force that I nearly stumbled, my hand gripping the wall beside me for support. I watched him move through the remaining raiders with a calm, deliberate focus that felt almost impossible, given everything he must have already endured in that narrow corridor, holding the line alone against numbers that should have overwhelmed him twice over. I raised my own weapon and moved to support him, adding what strength I could to the fight, though it became clear within moments that my assistance, while welcome, was far from necessary. Ethan fought not with wild desperation but with the same patient precision I remembered from our sparring sessions, reading each opponent's movement before they fully committed, redirecting their strength against them rather than meeting force with force alone. Within minutes, the corridor fell silent once more. The remaining raiders either fled or subdued, the breach finally secured with the shield generator humming back to full strength behind us. Ethan lowered his weapon slowly, his shoulders sagging with the exhaustion of what he had just endured, and turned to find me standing there, my own weapon still raised, though the danger had clearly passed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I simply stood there, staring at him, taking in every detail of the scene before me with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. The scorched armor, the cut along his forehead, the steady, exhausted breath moving through his chest. He had walked through fire, quite literally, to hold that breach, to protect not just the fuel depot behind him, but every officer stationed throughout Kestrel Outpost, myself included. And in that single, overwhelming moment, everything I had been refusing to name for weeks finally crystallized into something I could no longer deny. I was not simply relieved that a valued colleague had survived a dangerous encounter. I was not simply grateful that our defense protocols had held under pressure. What I felt, standing there in that scorched, silent corridor, was something far deeper, far more personal, something that had been quietly growing inside me since the very first day he stepped off that docking ramp with his easy, unhurried stride. I loved him. The realization struck with such force that I nearly forgot to breathe, my thoughts scrambling backward through every small moment I had dismissed as simple curiosity or professional interest. The way he always made sure I had eaten before he touched his own meal. The way his calm presence steadied me even in the darkest hours of preparation. The way my heart had nearly stopped when his signal went silent, a fear far sharper and more personal than simple concern for a colleague could ever explain. Every observation I had carefully filed away under simpler explanations suddenly rearranged itself into a truth I could no longer avoid. I had fallen for him slowly, quietly, across weeks of shared meals and late-night planning sessions and small, unnoticed kindnesses, and I had been too focused on duty, too unwilling to examine my own feelings closely, to recognize what was happening until the very real possibility of losing him forced the truth into painful, undeniable clarity. "Sen," Ethan said, his voice gentle, pulling me back into the present moment. "Are you all right?" I realized I had been staring at him in silence for far longer than appropriate, my weapon still raised, though there was no longer any threat remaining in the corridor around us. I lowered it slowly, my hands trembling slightly, though not from fear any longer. "I thought I lost the signal," I said, my voice unsteady in a way I rarely allowed it to be. "I thought something had happened to you." "Something did happen," he admitted with a tired, crooked smile. "Comm relay took a hit. I was a little busy to worry about fixing it at the time." His smile faded slightly as he studied my expression, perhaps noticing something in my face I had not yet managed to hide. "Hey," he said, his voice softening further. "I am all right. We are all right." I wanted to tell him everything in that moment, the full weight of what I had just realized standing there in the wreckage of the breach he had single-handedly defended. The words rose in my throat, urgent and overwhelming, but training and instinct held me back, reminding me that the battle was not yet fully over, that there would be time for such conversations once Kestrel Outpost was truly safe again. "We need to get you to the medical bay," I said instead, gesturing toward the cut along his forehead. "And I need to report back to Commander Vex that the breach is secured." Ethan nodded, though his eyes lingered on me a moment longer than the situation strictly required, as though he too had noticed something shifting between us, that neither of us was quite ready to name aloud. "Lead the way," he said simply. We made our way back through the scorched corridors together, my hand hovering near his arm more than once, as though I needed physical proof that he was truly there, truly safe, truly alive beside me. By the time we reached the command deck, Commander Vex had already received word that the eastern breach was secured, and the wider battle across Kestrel Outpost was finally turning in our favor. The remaining raider vessels retreated within the hour, unwilling to sustain further losses against defenses that had ultimately held firm despite the ferocity of their assault. Cheers rose across the command deck as the final ships withdrew beyond sensor range, officers embracing each other in relief after hours of tension and fear. I found myself standing quietly near the edge of the celebration, my eyes drawn again and again toward Ethan, who was being examined by our medic near the far wall of the deck. Commander Vex approached me as the initial celebration began to settle, his expression thoughtful as he studied my face. "Good work today, Sen," he said. Your coordination with Cole at the Eastern Breach likely saved this outpost from far greater losses." I thanked him quietly, though my mind remained fixed elsewhere, replaying the moment I had rounded that final corner and found Ethan still standing amid the wreckage he had single-handedly defended. Commander Vex seemed to notice my distraction, though he said nothing further, simply offering a small, knowing nod before moving on to address the rest of the gathered officers. I made my way toward the medical bay once the initial reports had been filed, finding Ethan seated on the edge of an examination table while our medic finished treating the cut along his forehead. He looked up as I entered, a tired but genuine smile crossing his face despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. "Come to check on your favorite human liaison?" he asked, his tone light despite everything we had both just endured. I found myself smiling despite the emotional weight still settling heavily in my chest. "Something like that," I admitted, moving closer to sit beside him once the medic finished her work, and stepped away to attend to other patients arriving from across the outpost. We sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the adrenaline of the battle slowly draining away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion neither of us bothered to hide from the other. I studied his profile in the quiet light of the medical bay, taking in the small details I had somehow never fully allowed myself to appreciate before: the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet strength still evident even in stillness, the simple, unguarded honesty that had defined every interaction between us since the day he first arrived. "Ethan," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He turned to look at me, his expression open and patient, waiting for whatever I needed to say. I found the words gathering in my throat again, urgent and overwhelming just as they had been in that scorched corridor, though this time, with the immediate danger fully past, I found myself hesitating over how to properly express something I had only just allowed myself to fully understand. "Thank you," I said instead, the words feeling insufficient even as I spoke them, "for holding that breach, for everything you have done since you arrived here." Ethan studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful and searching in his gaze, as though he sensed there was far more beneath my simple words than I had yet found the courage to say aloud. "That is what partners do," he said quietly. "We look out for each other." The word partners settled somewhere deep and warm inside my chest, though I knew, even as he spoke it, that what I felt reached far beyond simple professional partnership. I did not correct him in that moment, did not yet find the courage to voice the fuller truth pressing against my heart. Instead, I simply nodded, allowing the quiet comfort of his presence beside me to settle the last of the fear still lingering from the long, terrifying hours of battle. There would be time, I told myself, for the fuller conversation still waiting between us. For now, it was enough simply to sit beside him in the quiet aftermath of survival, grateful beyond measure that the realization which had finally crystallized within me in that scorched corridor had not come too late. The days following the attack settled into a slower, quieter rhythm, though nothing about Kestrel Outpost felt quite the same as before. Repair crews worked around the clock to restore damaged sections of the station, patching scorched walls and rebuilding shattered equipment, while the rest of us returned gradually to our regular duties. Commander Vex filed his official reports to Coalition Command, praising the outpost defense for holding against a raider force far larger than our small station had ever been expected to withstand. I threw myself into the work of recovery, partly out of genuine duty, and partly because the steady rhythm of repair and routine gave me something to focus on besides the overwhelming realization still sitting heavy in my chest. I saw Ethan often during those days, working alongside repair crews, checking in on injured officers recovering in the medical bay, offering his usual quiet steadiness to a station still shaken by how close the attack had come to overwhelming us entirely. Each time our paths crossed, I found the words I had been carrying since that scorched corridor rising in my throat, only to retreat again beneath the weight of uncertainty. I did not know how such a confession would be received, whether the closeness we shared meant the same thing to him as it now clearly meant to me, or whether I risked damaging something valuable by reaching for something more. My people were not always skilled at expressing such things through words alone, relying instead on the subtle language of color and gesture that had served us for generations. Yet Ethan could not read my colors the way another Velari might, and I understood that if I wanted him to truly know what I felt, I would need to find the courage to say it plainly, in words he could understand without translation. Commander Vex called a formal gathering nearly a week after the attack, assembling the entire outpost in the main hall to formally recognize those who had distinguished themselves during the battle. I stood among the gathered officers as Commander Vex spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hall as he described the courage and sacrifice shown across every division during those long, dangerous hours. When he reached the account of the Eastern Breach, his voice grew more solemn, describing how a single officer had held that critical position alone against overwhelming numbers, buying precious time for repairs that ultimately saved the fuel depot and, by extension, the entire outpost. Ethan stood quietly near the front of the gathered crowd as Commander Vex called him forward, presenting him with a formal commendation that acknowledged his bravery before the assembled officers of Kestrel Outpost. I watched him accept the commendation with the same quiet humility he had shown since his arrival, offering only a brief, sincere word of thanks before stepping back into the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of attention focused so fully upon him. It was, I realized, entirely in keeping with everything I had come to understand about him over these past weeks. His strength, never seeking recognition for its own sake, always offered simply because it was needed. After the ceremony concluded, and the gathered officers began dispersing back toward their duties, I found myself drawn toward the outpost's small observation deck, a quiet space near the upper levels of the station, where a wide viewport offered an unobstructed view of the stars beyond. It had become, over the past weeks, a place I often retreated to when I needed a few private moments to think, and that evening, with so much still unresolved within me, I found myself needing exactly that. I was not entirely surprised, some time later, to hear familiar footsteps approaching along the corridor behind me. Ethan stepped onto the observation deck and paused a respectful distance away, his expression questioning, as though silently asking whether his presence was welcome. I offered a small nod, and he crossed the remaining distance to stand beside me at the viewport, both of us falling into a comfortable silence as we watched the distant stars. "Quite a week," he said eventually, his voice quiet in the stillness of the empty deck. I found myself smiling despite the tension still coiled within me. "That may be the simplest possible way to describe it," I admitted. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet space around us. "I have been thinking," he said after a moment, his tone shifting into something more careful, more deliberate, "about what happened at the breach, about afterward, in the medical bay." My chest tightened, uncertain where the conversation might lead, though something in his careful tone suggested he too had been carrying unspoken thoughts these past several days. I turned to look at him fully, finding his gaze already fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart quicken despite my uncertainty. "You called me your partner," I said carefully, choosing to meet the moment directly rather than continue circling around it, "and I did not correct you, though I think, if I am honest with myself, that what I feel reaches beyond simple partnership." The words hung in the air between us, more vulnerable and exposed than anything I had said aloud in longer than I could remember. Ethan's expression softened, something gentle and hopeful replacing the careful uncertainty that had lingered there a moment before. "I have been trying to find the courage to say something similar," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more honest than I had ever heard it. "Since the day I arrived here, honestly, you were the first person on this outpost who treated me like a person rather than a story you had heard whispered in briefings. That meant more to me than I think I let myself realize, until that fight at the breach, when all I could think about while I was holding that line was making sure I made it back to see you again." My breath caught at the simple honesty of his words, the blue along my arms deepening in a way I no longer felt the need to hide from him. "I told you my colors reveal emotion more honestly than words," I said softly. "Perhaps it is only fair that I offer you the same honesty in words that you cannot read on your own." "I love you," I said simply, the words far easier to speak once I had finally found the courage to begin. I have loved you, I think, for longer than I allowed myself to understand, and it was only when I feared I had lost you that everything finally became clear. Ethan reached out and gently took my hand, his fingers warm against mine despite the cool air of the observation deck. I love you too, he said, his voice steady and sure despite the vulnerability of the moment. I think I have for a while now as well. I just did not want to say anything until I was certain it would not complicate things between us, given everything we still have ahead of us out here. We stood together at the viewport for a long moment, hands intertwined. The weight of unspoken feelings finally settled into something clear and shared between us. The stars beyond the glass seemed to shine a little brighter in that moment, though I understood the change was likely only within myself, the world around me unchanged while everything within me had shifted entirely. Commander Vex is already talking about the next joint mission, Ethan said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between us with a small, teasing smile. Apparently, Coalition Command wants to expand the human liaison program based on how well things went here. Looks like you might be stuck working with me for a while longer yet. I found myself laughing, a genuine, unguarded sound that felt like a release of everything I had been holding tightly within myself these past weeks. I think I can manage that, I said, squeezing his hand gently. In the days that followed, our partnership continued much as it had before, filled with shared duties and quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of life on a frontier outpost. But everything now carried a warmth and openness that had been carefully guarded before. We no longer hid the small moments of care between us, no longer dismissed them as simple professional courtesy. When he made sure I ate before a long shift, I understood it now for the quiet affection it truly was. When my colors deepened in his presence, I no longer felt the need to explain it away with simpler reasons. Kestrel Outpost slowly returned to its full strength, the scorched corridors repaired, the shield generators upgraded with lessons learned from the attack, the defense protocols Ethan and I had built together refined further with the hard experience of real combat behind them. Reports from neighboring outposts suggested the Skarn raiders, having suffered heavy losses in their failed assault, had retreated deeper into the outer belt, unlikely to test our defenses again anytime soon. Commander Vex called one final meeting before the season's end, gathering the senior officers to discuss the outpost's future assignments now that the immediate danger had passed. He spoke of expanding our partnership with Coalition Command, of the growing respect other outposts held for what we had accomplished at Kestrel, and of new opportunities that lay ahead for those officers who had proven themselves during the crisis. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out toward their evening duties, Ethan caught my eye across the room, offering a small, warm smile that carried none of the careful distance from those early days when I had first led him through the outpost's corridors as little more than a professional obligation. I returned the smile easily, feeling none of the confusion or denial that had once clouded my understanding of what passed quietly between us. We walked together toward the observation deck that evening, as had become our custom in the weeks since that honest conversation beneath the stars, settling into comfortable silence as the wide viewport once again framed the endless dark beyond our small outpost. Ethan's hand found mine without hesitation, familiar now in a way that filled me with quiet contentment rather than uncertain longing. I thought of everything that had led us to this moment, the tense alarm that had first announced his arrival, the quiet days of growing partnership I had dismissed as simple curiosity, the terrifying silence when his signal had gone dark during the breach, and the overwhelming clarity that had finally broken through my careful denial the moment I saw him standing alive amid the wreckage he had single-handedly defended. Every step of that journey, painful and uncertain as parts of it had been, had led me here, standing beside him with a truth finally spoken and fully shared between us. Whatever challenges still waited beyond the dark edge of our small outpost, whatever future assignments Coalition Command might send our way, I understood now that I would face them with a clarity I had never possessed before that battle forced the truth into the open. I was no longer simply a defense officer stationed alongside a skilled and steady partner. I was someone who had finally allowed herself to recognize love when it walked, calm and unstoppable, straight into the fire, meant to keep us apart. The stars beyond the viewport stretched on endlessly, distant and unknowable, much as the future itself remained. But standing there beside Ethan, his hand warm in mine, I found I no longer feared what that future might hold. Whatever came next, we would face it together, and for the first time since his arrival at Kestrel Outpost, that simple certainty was enough.